Right. Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
This time, we're going even deeper into the world of Martin O.E., or Sai-Chak Wang, as many know him online. In our last deep dive, we kind of unpacked his story, the controversies surrounding him. But now we're shifting gears a little bit. We're focusing on his so-called enemies.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting angle, right? Because, who Oe considers to be his adversaries really tells us a lot about, his worldview and why his message, resonates with a certain audience.
This really does. It's like we're piecing together a puzzle, right? Trying to figure out the why behind those strong opinions and the really intense reactions that they provoke. But I think for folks who aren't super familiar with Hong Kong politics, it might feel like jumping into the middle of a movie.
Oh, for sure. Right.
So maybe we should rewind a little bit, set the stage.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, imagine, a community. This has gone through, a lot of political upheaval and feels really distrustful of a powerful authority,
Right.
Like in this case, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And that feeling of distrust, that fear of being silenced, persecuted, that's really key here.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of political tension, distrust. So where does Martin O.E. fit into all of this?
Well, he positions himself as the voice for those who are feeling kind of disillusioned and marginalized, right? And he taps into that existing fear of the CCP, and he presents himself as, like a champion against what he sees as there and encroaching influence even outside of mainland China.
So he's kind of become like this this figurehead rallying people against this common enemy.
Right.
But who exactly are these enemies in O.E.'s narrative? It can't just be the CCP, right?
Right, it goes beyond just the Chinese government, right? He often labels anyone who disagrees with him, even people within the Hong Kong diaspora community, as CCP supporters or agents, right? So it creates this us versus them dynamic, where even just questioning his views can lead to, being ostracized or even targeted by his followers.
That sounds pretty intense. So he's drawing a line in the sand. You're either with him or against him, and there's no room for nuance or debate.
Pretty much, yeah.
But why does this resonate with people? What makes them susceptible to this kind of rhetoric?
Well, I think there are a few factors at play here, right? For some, it's a sense of belonging, finding, solace and solidarity in a community that shares, their fears and their anxieties. Others might be drawn to, Oe's strong personality, his confident pronouncements, right? They see him as a leader who's offering simple solutions in what's a really complex and uncertain world.
So it's not just the message, it's the messenger too. It still feels like there's a missing piece here, though.
Yeah.
Why are people so quick to accept these claims, even when they're unsubstantiated? Or even inflammatory?
I think it goes back to that backdrop we talked about, right? That deep-seated distrust of the CCP.
Yeah.
For many in the Hong Kong diaspora community, that distrust is rooted in lived experiences, right? In actually witnessing the erosion of freedoms, the crackdown on dissent.
So O.E. is capping into a very real, a very deeply felt fear.
Yeah.
And that fear, combined with his charisma, and his ability to articulate those fears in a way that resonates, creates a powerful cocktail.
Yeah, exactly.
Pretty
And in
powerful.
that kind of environment, right, where emotions run high, it's really easy to see how critical thinking can take a back seat. People become less inclined to question the source or the validity of the information, right? Especially if it confirms their existing worldview.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we're starting to see how these enemies are constructed in O.E.'s narrative. It's not just about political affiliation or ideology. It's about creating this image of a powerful and insidious force that threatens the community. An enemy that must be confronted and defeated at all costs.
Right. And I think that's where things get really interesting, right? Because that narrative of an all-powerful enemy, it can be very seductive, especially in times of uncertainty or upheaval. It offers a really simple explanation for these complex problems.
Yeah.
A clear target for anger and frustration.
Yeah.
And a sense of purpose in the face of fear.
Okay, so we've established this context of fear and distrust. We're starting to understand how O.E. uses that to construct this narrative of us versus them. But let's get a little more specific. Who are some of these individuals or groups that he's targeted?
Well, one of the most prominent groups he often criticizes are those he perceives as being too accommodating to the CCP. He often labels them as, collaborators or traitors. And this can include politicians, journalists, academics, or even ordinary citizens who simply express views that O.E. disagrees with.
So anyone who doesn't fully subscribe to his hardline stance is automatically lumped in with the enemy.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
He creates this binary where any form of nuance or dissent is seen as betrayal or weakness. And this not only silences opposing viewpoints, but it also discourages critical thinking and fosters a climate of intolerance and suspicion.
It sounds like he's creating a very dangerous echo chamber, where his followers are only exposed to information that reinforces their existing beliefs and anxieties.
Right, and that's a key point. By constantly reinforcing this narrative of an existential threat, he cultivates this sense of urgency and fear that can make people more susceptible to his message and less willing to engage in, constructive dialogue or consider alternative perspectives.
So in a way, he's manufacturing his own enemies to solidify his position as like a leader and protector of the community.
Yeah, it's a tactic as old as time, right? Identify a threat, whether real or imagined, and then position yourself as the only one who can protect the people from that threat. It's a powerful way to gain and maintain influence, especially within a community that's already feeling, vulnerable and anxious.
Wow, this is starting to feel like a political thriller. But it's important to remember that this is real life with real people and real consequences.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to understand the dynamics at play here, the motivations behind this kind of rhetoric, and the potential impact on both individuals and the community as a whole.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork, but there's still so much more to unpack here. We talked about the broader context and the tactics used by OE to construct this narrative of us versus them. But in the next part, I really want to dive deeper into some specific examples to really get a sense of who these enemies are and how they're portrayed in OE's world.
Yeah, I think that's a great next step, By looking at specific cases, we can see how this narrative plays out in real time, how individuals are targeted, and, what the consequences are for those who dare to challenge OE's views.
Stay tuned, folks. Things are about to get really interesting.
All right, so let's get into some specific examples of who Martin OE considers his enemies and how he actually portrays them.
Yeah, in the last part, we were talking about how OE often labels those who disagree with him as CCP supporters or agents. But I'm curious to know how this actually plays out. Like, does he actually name names?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. He's not shy about calling people out directly. One example that comes to mind is a prominent Hong Kong journalist who has been, critical of OE's tactics. OE publicly accused this journalist of being a CCP mouthpiece, claiming that they were spreading propaganda and misleading the public.
Wow. That's a pretty serious accusation to just throw around. What happened after that? What was the fallout?
Well, it led to a barrage of online harassment directed at the journalists. OE's followers, they flooded the journalist's social media accounts with insults and threats, and even doxing, which is malicious act of publicly revealing someone's personal information online.
Hold on, doxing. Can you explain what that is and why it's so harmful?
Yeah, so doxing basically involves sharing someone's, home address, phone number, workplace, family details online, often with, malicious intent. It can expose the victim to harassment, stalking, identity theft, even physical harm. It's a serious violation of privacy, and it can have, really devastating consequences.
That's terrifying. So always accusations against this journalist didn't just stay online. They actually spilled over into real life.
Yeah.
And put this person's safety at risk.
Exactly. And this isn't an isolated incident either. He's used similar tactics against academics who have published research that challenges his views, politicians who've advocated for dialogue with the Chinese government, and even just, ordinary citizens who have expressed, maybe skepticism or disagreement in online forums.
Like he's weaponizing his platform to silence anyone who dares to question him. But wouldn't this backfire at some point? Wouldn't people eventually see through these tactics and reject this kind of behavior?
Yeah, you would think so, right. But remember, he's operating within this carefully constructed echo chamber where dissenting voices are kind of drowned out and any criticism is instantly dismissed as, CCP propaganda or a sign of disloyalty.
So he's essentially created this self-reinforcing cycle of fear and outrage.
Yeah.
The more he attacks his critics, the more his followers rally around him. And the harder it becomes for anyone to challenge his authority.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that this kind of rhetoric can have a really profound impact on individuals, especially those who are already feeling, vulnerable or marginalized.
Can you give an example? How does this affect real people?
Sure. Imagine you're a young person from Hong Kong. You're living abroad, you're trying to find your place in a new country. You're also grappling with, the political upheaval back home. You come across Oi's videos, and he's speaking directly to your fears, validating your anxieties, offering this sense of belonging in a community that shares your distrust of the CCP.
Yeah, that sounds pretty appealing, especially if you're feeling lost or isolated.
Exactly. But now imagine you start to question some of his claims, right? Or you
I don't know.
express a different opinion online. Suddenly you're labeled a traitor, a CCP agent,
Hmm.
an enemy of the community. You're bombarded with hateful messages. Your personal information is shared online. You're ostracized from the very group that once offered you solace and belonging.
That's heartbreaking. And it really highlights the real human cost of this kind of rhetoric. It's not just words on a screen. It's creating real divisions, fostering real fear, and putting real people at risk.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this isn't just happening on like the fringes of the internet. OE has a significant following and his influence is growing.
So this isn't just a case of one controversial figure with a loud voice. It's a symptom of a broader trend, a growing climate of intolerance and polarization, both online and offline.
Yeah, that's a crucial point, and it raises a lot of questions about the role of online platforms in amplifying this kind of rhetoric, the challenges of combating misinformation and hate speech, and the responsibility we all have to be more, critical and discerning in our online interactions.
Okay, so we've explored how OE uses his platform to target his enemies and the impact this can have on individuals. But in the next part, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the wider implications of this kind of behavior.
I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. What are some of the long-term consequences for the Hong Kong diaspora community, the political discourse surrounding Hong Kong, and even the way we think about, online influence and responsibility?
Stay tuned, folks. We're about to dive even deeper into this fascinating and unsettling story. All right, welcome back to the show.
So we spent this episode, really trying to understand who Martin Oe sees as his enemies and how he frames them as, threats to the Hong Kong diaspora community. But, where does this all lead? Especially as his influence, continues to grow.
That's the big question, isn't it? Because it's bigger than just one person's opinions at this point.
Right.
This kind of rhetoric, this kind of talk, it can really shut down open discussion and critical thinking within the entire community.
Right, like if anyone who disagrees with them is automatically labeled a traitor or a CCP agent, people are going to be too scared to speak their minds. It creates this atmosphere where everyone's self-censoring, where only one viewpoint is acceptable. Exactly, and that's incredibly damaging. It stops debate from happening, prevents people from exploring other solutions, and it can even justify harmful actions.
So it goes beyond just, freedom of speech. It's about creating a culture where people feel safe to share their opinions,
Yeah.
engage in real dialogue, even when those opinions are controversial or challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. And that's especially important for the Hong Kong diaspora community, right? I mean, they're already facing so many challenges and divisions.
Yeah, you're right. They're dealing with the trauma of political upheaval, trying to adapt to a new culture, trying to hold on to their identity and heritage. They don't need more division, more distrust on top of all of that.
Right, exactly. And this kind of divisive rhetoric, it can also have a ripple effect. It doesn't just impact the diaspora community, it affects the whole political conversation around Hong Kong.
I'm curious about that. What do you mean, how does this affect the bigger picture?
Well, when you have these influential figures like Oe constantly pushing this us versus them narrative, it becomes almost impossible to find common ground or work together towards solutions. It just breeds suspicion and hostility, making real dialogue and cooperation really difficult.
So it's not just about the people he's attacking directly. It's about the potential damage to the community's ability to stand up for itself, to have those constructive conversations with different groups, and to ultimately find a way forward that addresses the real challenges they're facing.
Exactly. And we also have to think about the impact on people outside the Hong Kong diaspora community too, right? When this kind of divisive talk is allowed to spread unchecked, it contributes to this bigger climate of intolerance and polarization in society as a whole.
It's a sobering thought. It's a reminder that what happens online doesn't just stay there. It has real-world consequences. It can change how people think, influence how they act, and even fuel conflict.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the question of responsibility. We all have a part to play in pushing back against this kind of harmful rhetoric, both online and offline.
What can we do, though? It often feels like we're just yelling into the void,
It's true. It can feel overwhelming. But there are things we can do. We can start by being more critical of the information we're taking in, question the source, look at different viewpoints, and be wary of anything that sounds too good to be true or just confirms what we already believe.
So it's about being more aware, more thoughtful, more skeptical in how we interact online.
Right. And we can also challenge this kind of rhetoric head on when we see it. Call it out, push back against misinformation, and amplify those voices of reason and moderation.
It's about speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable, and not letting hate and division win.
Exactly. And we can also support organizations and individuals who are working to promote media literacy, critical thinking, and constructive dialogue. There are people out there doing great work to counter misinformation and bridge those divides.
That's good to hear. So it's not about feeling helpless. It's about taking action, no matter how small, and realizing that together we can make a difference.
Absolutely. And remember, this isn't just about Martin Oe or the Hong Kong diaspora community. This is a challenge for all of us as we navigate this increasingly complex and interconnected digital world.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and I think it's clear this conversation needs to continue. This case brings up so many important questions about online influence, the responsibility that comes with having a platform, and the need to create a culture of critical thinking and respectful dialogue, both online and offline. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, keep asking those tough questions.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay informed.